Okay, so continuing along with some basics with watercolor. Uh, Remember that watercolor is meant to be used with water. So when you're cleaning your brush, you don't want to wipe all the water off the brush before you start to use it. You need that water in order to paint. So, maybe just a little shake or maybe a tiny little wipe off the side of the jar. That's all you're going to need. Watercolor, it's easier to create transitions from dark to light or light to dark if you've got a dark pigment. So, for example, if I create a painting over here and it starts off pretty dark, and then the more water that I add to it, the lighter it becomes. But I can create a lot of transition from dark to light if I have a dark pigment. If you're working with a pigment that is lighter, you don't have as much opportunity to have it go from dark to light because the paint already is light to begin with. So if you're going to create a painting that needs some strong shadows in it, you're going to want to have a pigment that is fairly dark. Now there's a couple different ways to darken your areas. You always want to make sure you start light and gradually move to darker and darker. So there's 3 different ways you can darken an area. And I'm going to start by just painting a circle here in blue. And this isn't tremendously dark. Okay, now I'm going to let that sit for a little while, and I'm going to move on to the next way to darken an area, and that is basically just to add less water. Now this will make it darker, but at a certain point, it doesn't work as effectively. You don't want to add so much paint and so little water that it starts to become like an acrylic. You'll tend to get more streaks in the paint when you paint with less water. If you're trying to get it super thick and super opaque, like I said, you might as well be using acrylic. It defeats the whole purpose of using watercolor. Watercolor should always remain transparent. So you want to make sure you're using a good amount of water with it. Now the third way to darken an area, if your pigment isn't dark to begin with, is to add a darker pigment to it. Now this will change the color, but it'll darken the area. Okay. Now there's a few different techniques for painting. We're going to come back to this one in a little while. There's a few different techniques to painting. And the first one is wet on wet. So this would be where you wet the paper ahead of time, and when you add the paint, you're adding it to an area that's already wet. Notice how the paint spreads out into the water. It'll spread all the way out eventually. And this is really good if you want to mix colors, mix the pigments right on the paper. They'll blend together. This is where also we're having a little piece of paper towel helps. Sometimes if you want, you can lighten an area by going back in and dabbing it with some paper towel or a sponge. You can do this as long as it hasn't dried. Now the second way is to just paint wet on dry. And this is just taking your watercolor brush right on a dry area and painting right on top of it. Now you'd use this if you want to get really hard edges, right? Look at the difference between the edge in this area and the edge on this area over here. Now the last way is something that's called dry on dry. And this is where you have paint on your brush, but not a lot of water. Notice as I get less and less water on the brush, more of the paper starts showing through. If this isn't the effect you want, then you need to add more water to your brush. It needs to be able to spread the paint smoothly and evenly. Painting like this, you'll oftentimes get streaks. You'll get areas where the paper shows through. If I try to paint on top of it, I'm going to get a lot more streaks. Now, sometimes artists do this on purpose because they want to create this effect. If that's the effect you want, dry on dry is a good way to go about it. Okay, looks like this is about dry, so I'm going to show you the third way to darken an area, and that is to create layers. Notice when I paint over this yellow area right here with blue, you can still see the yellow showing through. Just a little bit. Painting a darker area on top of a light area, it will cover. But what happens when I try to create a lighter area on a darker area? Notice how much more difficult it is to cover that pigment. But also notice what happens when the two colors overlap. They create a third color. Painting in layers is a really good way to watercolor. So when I paint with a second layer on top of this circle, notice what happens to the inside of this area. It gets darker. Okay, can you see that? The circle gets darker as I add layers to it.